I'm probably not the only one who was surprised by just how good The Last of Us HBO adaptation was, although we probably shouldn't have been. The old adage was that video game adaptations always suck, but in recent years that's been less and less universal. The Sonic movies were surprisingly popular, and recently we had the tedious critics versus audience debate with the Super Mario movie. The reason for the video game to movie or TV transition being historically so hard is that the quality that makes video games appealing is hard to translate into a non-interactive medium without losing a little part of what made the original what it was. Because interactive stories are designed with the interactivity being kind of a key component, otherwise, why is this a video game? Surely if you wanted to just make a movie, you would have just made a movie, wouldn't you, Quantic Dream? With The Last of Us, I was apprehensive that we would get a similar situation where the appealing factor gets lost in translation. The Last of Us works on the basis of providing the every person with a realistic fantasy of what it would actually be like to survive the breakdown of society. A lot of people like to imagine how they would survive the apocalypse, and The Last of Us provides you with the means to test that fantasy. You play as Joel, an average working class guy with a beard in a plaid shirt who worked a busy, stressful job with long hours before the virus hit. 2 decades after Outbreak Day, he's surviving. Just like you would be if a virus outbreak that turns everyone into mutant monster things happened, right? I know I would definitely be a survivor like Joel is. I definitely wouldn't inevitably be the first person to get killed by an infected and or shot in the head by the military if something like that actually happened. And the point is that Joel starts doing really shitty things, and you have to morally square the fact that in this fantasy where Joel, you, the average guy who's been surviving this apocalypse, is a bit of a monster. The interactive nature of the experience is key to it. In your fantasy, where you're doing what you need to do to survive this apocalyptic wasteland, you lose your sense of right and wrong along the way. Joel the every person strangles everyone he comes across without a second thought, infected or not. The Last of Us provides you with your surviving the apocalyptic wasteland fantasy and challenges it by going, this version of you surviving this wasteland would have a warped sense of humanity, because it set it in the context of a video game where killing lots of people is kind of a necessity to progress. Remove the interactive avatar component of The Last of Us and it's basically just a zombie apocalypse story with a bit more heightened emotional realism than most. Oh sorry, not a zombie story, infected. That is an important distinction to make that is like meaningful and stuff, even though the conventions of the genre are basically all the same. But it does stand out from the crowd of games trying to give your average person the zombie survivor fantasy by having Joel as the gruff hairy dad who lost his daughter, gaining a surrogate father-daughter relationship by being stuck together with Ellie by circumstance. He feels like a solid character that the player can inhabit. It's a very strong hook, and the result is that the characters feel a bit more real than most standard video game protagonists. And that works in tandem with the fact that Ellie's at least got a decent sense of humour and playfulness to her. There's a humanity to The Last of Us that's missing from a lot of these types of games. It made an impact because it's not just dreary and depressing. Well, the first one isn't. So an adaptation was always going to be good because The Last of Us was at least one of the strongest examples of the genre, but whether it would be great was a difficult question. I ultimately wasn't sure how I was going to end up taking the show with the interactive elements stripped out because fidelity is what everyone always talks up with adaptation. Being true to the source material is supposed to be the goal of any adaptation, because if the source material has been changed, then that means it's automatically bad for some reason. A generic opinion that most people have, that's easy to have, that you hear all the time with every adaptation of anything, and that I don't agree with one bit. There's loads of cases where an adaptation has flown in the face of the source material and come up smelling of roses. My favourite movie's Watership Down. It's barely anything like the book. The Shining, the movie, only sort of resembles The Shining, the book. Did anyone watch the miniseries from the 90s that followed the book a lot more closely? Well, if you did, chances are you still thought the less faithful adaptation was better. Why is fidelity a measure of good in adaptation? I personally think this general opinion that people have is an emotional reaction that's usually not really rooted in what the adapters have actually done. The reason that adaptations do or don't work is often more complicated than it's not the same. If you wanted a totally faithful adaptation of a video game, couldn't you just play the video game again? What's the point? The adapters gotta do something with it, don't they? So when I started seeing side-by-side comparisons of The Last of Us the game and Last of Us the TV show that showed us just how closely it flew to the source material, with the implication being this is why it's good, I was kinda rolling my eyes a bit and expecting it to be basically the game but with the gameplay stripped out, which in some scenes it is. How are we going to get through this bit? Look, there's a rusty thing that we can walk through to avoid the searchlights. However, The Last of Us the TV show takes the core elements of the game that made it stand out from the crowded field of zombie apocalypse games and translates it into a completely different context with such efficiency that it's the new gold standard for how video games can change mediums. In a video game, you wouldn't be able to get away with spending so long on the quiet, everyday stillness pre-outbreak that they do in the series. So we introduce Joel and Sarah, a single-parent family. Tommy is Joel's brother. They have a bit of interplay to show us how they are as father, daughter and uncle. This is obviously done to set the context for how violently the outbreak changes the world and set Joel up for his emotionally broken, bereft father character arc. Dramatically, you'd think that everyday stillness contrasted with the outbreak would be a prerequisite for a story like this to work, but if showing us the pre-outbreak world was done to this extent in the video game, I would just be sat watching a cutscene for 40 minutes with a controller in my hands going, so when is the game going to start? This is what I'm saying when I make the point that when we go to an interactive medium, we want something different out of our storytelling to a non-interactive one. Look at almost every Quantic Dream game. Game starts, you spend ages having to do basic things like walk around a middle-class person's house doing chores, supposedly to feel that stillness and contrast for when the action starts like you would in a TV show or a movie, but I'm not feeling that atmosphere. I'm just bored and I'm waiting for a reason for me to start pushing buttons. I can't lose myself in the story and really feel that anticipatory stillness of modern life when I'm just waiting for my opportunity to offer contextual input. Games demand a lot more immediacy from their storytelling. It was quite powerful of the game to open with the player in control of Joel's daughter, Sarah, and she explores the house at night as she hears the building chaos outside. This allows the player to take an active role in the story, taking in and exploring the environment before the story takes a violent left turn, transfers control to Joel, then it essentially kills not just Joel's daughter, but you. You inhabited this role briefly, this was meant to be the character you were playing as, but nope, she's gone. By comparison, the show is going to make Sarah feel like a real person connected to the viewer in a different way, and so we follow her throughout her day prior to the outbreak. She goes and visits her neighbours, she goes to a shop to get Joel's watch fixed while the apocalypse gets going in the background, in a similar way to Shaun of the Dead. I'm getting to know the character's world and her everyday reality, not through exploring it personally, but by the character of Sarah showing it to me. Being shown the world and exploring the world personally are equally valid tactics for storytelling, but games do one and TV and movies do the other, and when adapting it, the tactics for storytelling change. The show isn't just expanding on the background of the outbreak that we got glimpses of in the games, it's using the background to demonstrate the contrast between pre- and post-outbreak worlds. The game doesn't need to do that because the player brings their own context of the everyday reality they live with, and the game then indulges them in this grimy, ruined version of a world that's recognisable as their own, but altered in a way that's more intense and exciting. And the feeling you get from exploring that personally is just different from the feeling you get from sitting and watching that same story play out. Similarly, the action has been seriously pared back in the show. There's relatively few gunfights when compared to the games, where it feels like every 5 minutes you stumble across another group of enemies to strangle and shoot at. And the reason for using violence much more sparingly is because dramatic moments of violence would become desensitizing after a while if we're just watching them and not participating. It's got to really mean something for Joel to beat the shit out of a guy with his bare hands in the show. In the games, he does it every 5 minutes. Here it happens just the once, and it's made more intense by a prior scene establishing Joel being an acquaintance with this guy. The beating is one of episode 1's more intense acts of violence, and Ellie looks on in complete horror to establish how she initially sees Joel. If this scene came after showing Joel brutally strangling enemy after enemy in the lead up to meeting Ellie as happens in the games, it wouldn't be nearly as meaningful. But that works in the game because in the context of the game, it would bore you to fucking tears having to wait nearly as long to strangle your first enemy. One single death has really got to mean something if you're just sat there watching it. But imagine a third-person action game where you only kill one enemy every hour or so. The goal of the game is to make Joel and the player into a symbiotic character, where it assaults you with the fact that by the end of it, your every person relatable avatar going through his gruff hairy dad learning to love again story has killed hundreds and hundreds of people, and he dooms the world to the rest of the apocalypse by refusing to sacrifice Ellie. It operates as a personal attack on the player, because it recognises that you are a part of this experience and uses that as an emotional pressure point. It's there to show you that an average everyday person like you has these violent tendencies inside of you. If the world was changed in the way it's changed in The Last of Us, you would strangle people without a moment's thought, and a part of you would enjoy it. Because look, here you are coming to a video game to live out that fantasy in a context where acting this way has been normalised. The game has empowered you in that way. By contrast, in the show, watching Joel engage in violence is meant to disempower you. The viewer joins Ellie in just watching Joel beating a man to death and being horrified that he's been driven to a point where whether or not he should beat this guy to death isn't a question to him. This moment retains its power because we watch Joel go from his everyman single father to just couldn't give a shit wreck of a man who can just chuck a dead body of a kid into a fire without feeling anything. The violence Joel metes out in the show is drawn into sharper focus and is made much more tragic when used sparingly. Following the brutal beating, Ellie starts pressing Joel for more information. Is something like this an everyday occurrence for him? We know it is in the games because we see and occupy him while he partakes in it, but in the show his response is basically written in his expression, his mannerisms, everything about him. And he gives you that broken and just defeated tone to his voice. It makes the idea of violence much more powerful when we just see small snippets of what Joel's life is like now and how he has to just brush it off. The change in the context of the story is also noticeable in cases like the clicker attacks. In the game, sure I'm anticipating an attack when I hear the clicks around the corner, but in that form of anticipation, I'm made to think about my strategy for dealing with it, and the level of danger changes based on what weapons I have to hand. When I'm not in control of Joel and I'm just watching him and Ellie being subject to an attack, just one single clicker is enough to make me apprehensive, as opposed to the waves of them that you see in the game. I can't press a button and have Joel make a Molotov cocktail here. The game makes the danger more intense by throwing you through waves and waves of enemies, but the show has got to get you emotionally invested in the characters as people, and so high intensity scenes of characters confronting each other becomes much more central than the fight scenes. Casting was probably the key concern when they were making this, and the cast they've got fortunately happened to be some of the strongest actors possible for these roles, but not in ways you might expect. Pedro Pascal is an amazing actor, but his voice is a lot softer than I would have expected of a Joel casting, but it fits so well, especially in that monologue in episode 6 where he breaks and starts confessing how this journey has made him feel. Since I mentioned Fidelity earlier, I think it made a lot of sense to have the first couple of episodes, while altered in a significant enough way to make the new format for the story work, had them fly quite close to the source material, while episode 3 takes a wild left turn from the games and is the one the internet went nuts for. In the game, Bill is a lonely survivalist whose main purpose in the narrative is to give Joel a working car. Bill is a tool for game progression, and his backstory is relatively minor because he's not the point of the game, and his connection to Joel is only really there to fill out Joel's role in the story. To make it so it's not a case where Joel's daughter died and then he just vanished from reality for 20 years and reappeared as this broken, grizzled older guy. Joel's actually been doing stuff between point A and point B in the story. His purpose is to give the player a firmer basis for the role that they inhabit in the story themselves. Whereas in the show, if Bill was just an incidental character that Joel runs into to give him story progression component X, that would be an example of what snobby critics mean when they say a movie or show is like a video game. It's like a video game became a derogatory term that film critics started to use around the late 2000s. And it's a term that gamers rightly took issue with, but there is actual meaning behind this criticism. It's just phrased in a clumsy way and forgets to highlight that narrative purpose in films and video games are just different. I always thought the Pirates of the Caribbean movies were like video games that you couldn't play. They were full of characters that felt like they existed solely for the purpose of offering items and objective markers and opening up previously inaccessible areas. And it just didn't work because I wasn't playing as a character in this experience myself. I was just sat there watching it, and I wasn't emotionally engaged in what I was watching. There is narrative purpose to characters like Bill in the games, but that narrative purpose is based more on what he can do for the player than who he is as a person. In the show, his backstory should be, and therefore is, fully fleshed out. We basically see the whole of Bill's life post-outbreak. He creates an infected and government-proof compound where he's self-sufficient, he's got everything he needs, but then Frank shows up, and Frank helps him come out of his shell, and life goes on in spite of everything that's happened. Bill and Frank hook up, they fight, they have friends over, Joel and Tess, and they try and regain some degree of normality. And this demonstrates to us how circumstances may have changed, but people ultimately haven't. They still want to have lives and some degree of community, it's not just about getting from day 1 to day 2. This episode also reminded me a lot of the unjustly cancelled sitcom The Last Man on Earth, which I will never stop being bitter about. That show was gold. Episode 3 shows how domesticity can make the apocalypse feel more real than non-stop violence. The goal of the game is to get me to question myself for finding catharsis in strangling everyone who gets in my way in a world that's reminiscent of my own. The goal of this episode, however, is to make you appreciate the normal life that these characters have lost and tried to regain. Ellie is jealous and wide-eyed when Joel says he got to fly in a plane, a basically impossible concept to her now. Bill bursts into tears just by getting to eat a strawberry again. And it is beautiful to see the lonely and misanthropic survivalist Bill finding someone he can finally connect to on an emotional level in the midst of the direst circumstances, something he couldn't even do when the world was normal, and even now, lovers get terminally ill and still die. Of course, in the game, Frank ran off and got infected and hung himself and left Bill a bitter goodbye note, which wouldn't be nearly as meaningful if it was done this way in the series. In the game, Frank and Bill's relationship is a component of the ruined environment that you're exploring to fill it out with this emotional texture. Bill and Frank's relationship has been completely reinvented in service of a different goal of the series to emphasise the struggle of the characters to retain their humanity in the face of the direst circumstances. This goal of making you appreciate the world that you could lose at any minute is there in the games, of course. The seeds of it are in scenes like the famous giraffe scene, but these seeds are in addition to the interactive player component of the experience. The show is right to use these moments as a jumping off point for making the adaptation less about the extreme violence that everyday people are capable of, and more about everyday people clinging onto an old world that those of us watching take for granted. They also emphasise the humanity of the characters by placing much more importance on humour. They've basically taken out the gunfights and swapped them for jokes, which I think is the right move. The magazine scene where Ellie makes Joel feel uncomfortable is basically done beat for beat in the show, but they've also increased the role of Ellie's book of puns, which is more of an afterthought in the game, but here the book is incredibly important to the character arcs. Ellie prods the stern and humourless Joel with her puns over the course of an episode, and he brushes it off and sees her as a stupid little kid, but she finally gets to him when they're settling down to sleep.
Did you know diarrhea is hereditary?
What?
It runs in your genes.
Jeez.
In the game, it gives you, the player, the father figure protector role for Ellie. So showing how Ellie forms this connection with Joel has to be done by more than just a 2-minute scene where she jokes around and makes him feel uncomfortable. The show achieves that by having her be direct in trying to get him to open up. She shows an interest in how all this violence affects him as a person, and in return he has to do the same and remember that she is just a kid. He's cagey with her about his past because he can't let his grief over Sarah and Tess slow him down, because if you slow down you're dead. But hardening himself to his emotions in order to protect himself doesn't mean he has to be an arsehole to Ellie. I think Bella Ramsey is perfect casting for this. Bella captures that annoying brattish aspect of Ellie so well, but not too annoying that she becomes overbearing. Ellie was always kind of annoying, but that's part of her charm. She lightens the mood. She's interested in the old world, and by pushing Joel into teaching her about it, she pushes him along on this inner journey that he has towards dealing with his grief that he's hardened himself against. I can just listen to Ellie throw things at Joel to get him to open up for hours on end. I found I didn't even need that many action scenes. The Last of Us may have been a third-person action game, but the show is a road movie that didn't even make me think about needing to control these characters to immerse myself in the experience, because the restructuring that the story's undergone to remove the interactive component means that you don't really need to. I have a hard time saying which I liked the most on the whole. In some cases, like the ending, the show can hit much harder than the game did. I must admit the ending to the game never quite worked for me. It makes sense, as the game's purpose is to confront you with the horrors that an everyday person is capable of. But given I inhabited this role personally, and the character's goal in the game is to take Ellie with me wherever I go and whatever I do, I ended up feeling like saving Ellie at the end was justified because I'm supposed to take Ellie with me. It's what I should do. Whereas in the show, when I'm not in control of Joel, I ended up feeling kind of physically sick watching him discover that the Firefly scientists can use Ellie to make a cure, but she'll die in the process. And he makes the snap decision to mercilessly slaughter every single person in sight to save her. The violence from Joel had been relatively sporadic until now, so it's made much more intense here. That, and they showed us a flashback of Marlene taking Ellie from her infected mother as a baby and promising to take care of her. So we know just how hard this decision must have been for Marlene, so Joel looks even more selfish. And that comes back to the different purposes of the game and the series. In the game, I'm empowered. In the show, I'm disempowered. The viewer has been so heavily invested in Joel and Ellie's journey over the course of the series that yes, we want Ellie to get out of this alive and go home and live with Joel for the rest of her life. But from that conversation they have after the giraffes where she says they've got to finish it, you know that if she had the choice, she would have given herself up. But Joel doesn't give her that choice. Neither you nor Ellie have any power in that decision. Of course you understand why Joel feels like he can't sacrifice Ellie. Because no, it wouldn't be fair for someone who's lost so much and has only just regained his sense of self. He's laughing and joking with Ellie again. He's not shutting himself off from his grief anymore. He can now talk about Sarah openly. He's completed his character arc. But that makes the moral dilemma even more tragic and makes the sense of disgust you feel at what he does even more profound. Ultimately, the game and the show tell the same story, and while the show may take some scenes wholesale, they're built in completely different ways. And that's why The Last of Us has succeeded where so many game adaptations before it have failed. And there's a lot for future adaptations to learn from here. People do want the same basic story, or they'll start saying that fidelity is the problem, so you can't go for a total overhaul. But if you're not doing the total overhaul and are hitting the same basic story beats, it's important to remember that you're not reverse engineering an interactive medium into a non-interactive one. You're engineering an explicitly non-interactive experience. You're using the original blueprint of the story as an outline, rather than a strict set of instructions.